So when I graduated from business school and came here and I went back a year later to recruit, people would ask me, which of your classes did you use the most? And I always said, oh, it's actually the organizational behavior classes, which is how do you get things done in a big company?
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm your host Nayan Jadeja over here today with another series of our Engati CX interviews with some of the top luminaries and experts in their space. And it's exciting today to welcome Satyajeet Salgar to our program today. He is currently a director of product management at Google. He leads multiple teams and has led teams and organizations in building products and businesses which are at the intersection of tech and media. He has built some amazing products and, believe it or not, multiple products with more than 1 billion monthly active users, which is pretty amazing, Satyajit.
Thank you.
He continues to push innovation and creativity across dimensions that touch technology, art, business, and media. Currently, he's leading the product team on Google Search. Before that, he led the product team for features across UI experiences, and also was leading Google Assistant and Search. And he's also had past stints with YouTube, gaming, payments, and ads, almost everything that we touch on a daily basis. Interestingly, he mentors and advises many startups. He often is a speaker about building products, technology, user experience, and leadership, and is actually also a guest lecturer at graduate schools like Stanford, Chicago, and Michigan. Welcome to the program, Satyajit. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Nan. I'm excited to chat with you.
I guess let's begin with the kind of obvious question that comes in. You are within a company like Google, and working on these products, which probably could be, if you hive them off as separate companies, they are big enough to be bigger than most other companies out over there, right?
Yep.
So
that's true.
How do you go about doing this, in terms of building something completely new and innovative, and exciting people of being, everybody talks of being or working in startups to do something new and innovative, but you have been able to do that being a part of Google. So I'm sure people would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I think it's I tell people for the first 8 or 9 years of my career at Google, I was working on completely new areas every 1.5 2 years, right? YouTube, ads, payments, games, YouTube again, back to search. So entire domains would change. But even within that, I found that like we were trying something new or innovative on a regular basis. Now I think to some extent, I think it speaks to the ambition of the company and the ambition of the founders early on, which is there was this idea of like let's not be static. Let's always push bounds in new areas. Let's push something forward. And I think like I'd say there's it's a little bit of a double-edged sword trying to do new things at a big company, right? So to your point, right, it is you do have to think about how what you're trying to do fits into the overall structure of the company, right? Is it appropriate for the brand? There's honestly just much more scrutiny because you're doing it as a big company. What are the risks? How does it fit in another business? So all these questions come in. But on the flip side, right, you're not starting from scratch. You can sort of take advantage of technology that's been built, people that have expertise, and all of those things. So I feel like it's a double-edged sword in terms of doing something new. In terms of how to start it, I think it's always you start with the consumer and make the case, right? I think at a startup, it's you're making the case to your investors, you're making the case to employees you're trying to hire, like, and you're trying to build momentum and go build something. At a big company like Google, I think you're similarly sort of you're trying to do what you can with the resources you have, but when you want more, you're making the case to upper management, you're making the case to like staff the team up, you're making the case to like staff resources. But it's very similar in many ways. I think the interesting part is as long as you're focused on the consumer and like quantifying the business opportunity, the ambition is there uh, uh, to do these things. I think sort of the dynamics are different in a bigger company. You're managing different risks, you're managing different people, but the desire to sort of, okay, is there a consumer need? Can we do something interesting? Will it eventually be, sort of a good business? All of those questions are always the same. So I think I think partially speaks to my desire to always do lots of new things. So I find after a while I want to push something, but also it speaks to the ambition of the company to try different things.
I'm sure a lot of, either product managers or wannabe product managers probably would learn a lot in terms of, one of the biggest challenges always in front of PMs is new feature introduction or new feature launch and unique ways of doing that. So what advice would you give to the, PMs out there in terms of your thought process?
I think your number one job as a PM, right, is to define the product strategy and then execute on a successful. So I think for me, definition of the product strategy means saying, okay, what is it that we're trying to do? What is the game we're trying to play? And how are we keeping score? So specifically, what is your strategy? Why do you think it will work? And what are the metrics that you keep in place so that you know, is this working or not? Am I succeeding? Am I failing? What signals do I have? So to me, that's sort of the biggest thing that you do as a product manager. You have the sense of, okay, I'm articulating what needs to get done, and if we do these things right, and the market likes what we have, the technology is working, these metrics will move in this direction. And I think if they don't, I think you sort of learn to adjust. So I think the tricky part really is coming up with that North Star metric, right? What is the thing that will move, that will actually tell you things. So for example, like a lot of large companies, I think if at a smaller company where you're starting from zero, it's easy to say, okay, users, and I'll look at how my DAU is growing and it'll be fine. At a lot of companies, especially with mature products, it's really hard to move DAU, right? And DAU is almost like a lagging indicator, right? So you do a bunch of things right, then in time your user numbers will move. So figuring out what is that metric that you can move on a regular basis, that tells you, okay, my consumers are happy, my business is working, is I think the tricky part. And fortunately, there's like lots of frameworks out there now to like think about metrics. My favorite one actually, it's weird. Like I think Google published this like years ago, but I found it only last year. But I thought it was a comprehensive way to think about it. They came up with the acronym. I think it's HEART, which is this notion of how happy are your users. That's the H. How engaged are they? What's the adoption like? What's the retention like? And what's the task completion like? So that framework is a good way to think about, okay, is my product growing? Are people sort of are consumers and customers happy? And are they actually getting the thing they wanted to get done? So I think that framework sort of fits what you need to do. And that tells you, okay, is my product strategy working? Is my product working?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure everybody is now Googling and searching for heart.
Yeah, I know. It's I found like it's a good comprehensive framework for metrics.
Right. Okay, cool. Curious about, and I think you mentioned like you started at some point with YouTube and then did a few others and then actually went back to YouTube if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Right. And obviously there is this concept as products mature, right, the complexity tends to grow exponentially as well, right?
Yep.
And so how do you kind of think through and deal with product complexity?
I'd say like it's a stepwise process, right? The first is sort of recognizing the complexity and the sources of it. And I think complexity comes from many things. It comes from sort of just the industry, right? So for example, something like YouTube, you're serving video, and so you're thinking about video, but you're also like you're sort of taking an incredible amount of bandwidth across the internet. So suddenly you're thinking about, okay, how am I dealing with internet infrastructure? You're thinking about ISPs. You're thinking about monetization and sort of the implications of all the sort of ad revenue coming on there. You're thinking about the music industry because a large part of your thing is music. You're thinking about the gaming industry. So there's a certain amount of industry complexity that comes in. There's a certain amount of just product complexity over time, right? Like as you know, a lot of these products now are sort of 15, 20. Search, for example, which I work on now, is like a 22-year-old product. And so there's just layers and layers of things that have gotten built over time. So there's technical complexity, product complexity, to the extent where sometimes something will happen, and I've been on search a long time now, and I'll go like, wait, that's how it works? I had no idea. And people that have been here like almost 2 decades will say that sometimes.
Right.
So I think first of all is just acknowledging that okay, these are all the sources of complexity. But after that, it's sort of this notion of asking the right questions and getting to okay, what is the real? Sometimes the complexity can sort of paralyze you if you're not careful, right? There's always an excuse you can make. There's always like it's like, oh, this looks too hard. Like, how can I do this? This industry is so complex. But the reality is the actual questions you get to can be like the actual questions can be quite simple despite all the complexity, right? Like, does this matter for consumers? Is this working? What is the core sort of point in this industry? So I think you almost want to sort of find a way to wade through the complexity to get to the simple question that will give you the thing that you need to know. So for me, it's I tend to, when I join a team, for the first few months, you don't want to jump to conclusions and you just ask a lot of questions. You're not afraid to like ask stupid questions, even after you've been in a meeting, after you've been in a team for a long time. But at the same time, it's very important to understand that like, at least my belief is the core issues are pretty simple. So when you hear things like, oh, this is very complex and there are lots of issues there, it's generally true, right? The people that are saying that are actually right, but you need to wade through that to get to, okay, how do you sort of solve this problem for consumers? And so at least my take is understand the complexity, but don't settle for like, oh, we can't do this because it's so complex, or don't get intimidated by it. Like, I think different managers and sort of leaders over time have told me like, no, the actual core issue is actually pretty simple. And I think you can pattern match, right? Like that's the amazing thing that I've seen like leaders do on this amazing sort of basis. When I've been lucky enough to work with sort of like sort of some of the top leaders at Google earlier on in their careers, and they had this ability to sort of very sort of politely say, hey, I think the thing that you're looking at should, maybe this is the answer. And it would be something they have thought about for all of 5 minutes. I may have spent like days and months thinking about it, and I found that they're able to very quickly say, okay, this problem looks like this problem that I knew spent a lot of time on, and it may not be the right answer, but let me at least propose a solution. And in many cases, the pattern actually sticks. Turns out to be the same.
Cool. Thanks for those insights. Again, something else, as the product manager, who's kind of always, in my view, the product manager kind of sits in the middle, right? I mean, you have the tech side on the one side, you have the business and the marketing, and you're trying to bring everybody together in terms of getting something to launch. So curious on whether you faced or kind of come across working and conflicts or stuff with regards to cross-functional teams and bringing everybody forward towards moving in the same direction.
Yeah, all the time. So the most unique answer I got in an interview when I asked someone like, hey, why do you want to be a PM, is most people talk about I want to build products, I want to have impact, etc., etc. This person said, oh, I really like working with people, and I think this is a good job for me. And it surprised me, but then I realized like, oh, that's you're right, like that's actually key in many cases to this, which is I think understanding people's incentives and understanding people well is a really important part of the job. And in general, so when I graduated from business school and came here, and I went back a year later to recruit, people had asked me, which of your classes did you use the most? And I always said, oh, it's actually the organizational behavior classes, which is how do you get things done in a big company? And so understanding, I'd say the number one thing is understanding people's incentives. So for example, like, product managers typically want to launch things, have impact. But sometimes that's what your engineering team wants as well. But sometimes, they are motivated by engineering complexity, or is I've seen a lot of managers, we've had this conversation of, oh, I can't put this team on this thing because this project is not complex enough. No one in the team will get promoted if they just work on something so simple. And so understanding, the incentives of your cross-functional counterparts, understanding the incentives of other teams. So being able to put yourself in their shoes and understand why they're saying what they're saying, which is, I've often worked with teams where my first reaction is, I have no idea why that team is doing this. I have no idea why this company is doing this. And your first reaction is to be frustrated and like, okay, figure out how to escalate or figure out, but then you sort of realize, okay, let me understand what's going on there. And once you do that, there's typically a way, my general philosophy is there's typically a way to sort of find this middle ground, find that compromise, have them see your point of view once you understand this. And so I think that's generally the way to work on it, like understanding people's incentives and then sort of acknowledging that part of the job is to get people on the same page. It's not to be sort of frustrated or intimidated by that conflict. And so I think once you sort of you've done that often enough, you learn to expect it, it sort of just becomes part of the job, and it's not as stressful as anything. As you know, sort of if you tell people cross-functional conflict, they think it's stressful. It's just part of the job at this point.
One of the comments you made earlier was, you try to simplify things and you're looking for, is this what the consumer wants?
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious, how do you try and understand what a consumer wants when the consumer for your product is pretty much every living human being on the planet?
There's a few different things. It's important to trust your instincts and use the product, right, that you're in, but it's really important not to sort of fall into the trap of you being the only consumer. I remember early on when I was at YouTube, the CEO at the time had an all hands, right? So he sort of had, how many people here are under 30? And, a lot of people had that, about half the room had their hands up. How many people under 25? Some people stood their hands up. How many people, are under 20? Just a couple of interns maybe had their hands up. And how many people under 15? Everyone had their hands down. And he said, oh, by the way, I think at the time there was some stat that's a third of our users under 15. So how are we understanding them? Starting with this understanding that you are not necessarily the consumer. Then B, that there's a bunch of techniques you can use to say, okay, I am not this person. How do I understand what they want? How do I develop empathy? Which is probably sort of the other big product manager skill, right? Which is you define your strategy based on your understanding of your customer, and the way you have that is you build empathy with that customer. So even if your use is really broad, you try and get a sense of, okay, what do these people care about? What are the segments? Why are they turning to me in a particular moment? And the insights always sort of surprise me, which is you do it through a combination of things. So one of my favorite things to do, and I think again, especially this has been true since I've been on search, is to sort of stare at anonymized logs at night. Like, okay, how are people actually doing using the product, right? Like, why did they query this? What did they click on? What sort of articles, if they, so right now I'm working on this thing called Discover, which is our sort of content recommendation feed. What are the things they're clicking on? What do they like? What do they say they like and click on something else? So logs is one way of looking at it. The ability to do analysis is really important. Interview people, right? So I think understanding your defaults and understanding people's defaults, right? So for example, why do they turn to the thing? Why do they use it? And there are formal ways to do it. There's informal ways to do it, right? There's informal ways, like there are PMs that I know that they meet anyone, they'll say, hey, do you use this thing? Tell me about it. Why do you use it? And they do it for their product. They do it for whatever the other person is using. I find it odd to in social context just ask people, but then I do find ways to be part of focus groups, sort of read a lot about things. So I think finding that way to develop empathy is important. Finding analysis is important. Reading a lot is important. And I always tell people, which is, it's not, none of these techniques are all sort of perfect, right? They all give you information. But the way to do that is by getting all this information, by observing people, by understanding, by like listening, by reading, by talking to people, by looking at logs. You sort of develop into an intuition of what's going on. And that's the thing that you look for to like, sort of understand like sort of what customers want, right? Like you sort of get this intuition across a whole bunch of different fields.
Curious. I mean, obviously, still top of mind these days still continues to be the pandemic across the globe. So, given your current role, have you seen kind of, differences in terms of, obviously, there's a natural, search intent has changed, but
Yep.
outside of, the fact that, okay, they might be looking for whatever hospitals and oxygen concentrators and stuff like that, has at a much larger macro level, have you noticed kind of changes in terms of user behavior before and after the?
Oh, completely. I mean, I think it's one of the most fascinating social science experiments that you can sort of look at, right? Which is, how has search behavior changed? So I work on media, and we saw this insane spike on like entertainment that people were searching for. And if the interesting part was, you could segment it by country, and you could, if you just even looked at a slice of traffic, you could be like, oh, it looks like lockdown is ending in this particular country, right? You could actually see the shape of the traffic and how it evolved. So there's definitely trends. I think like cooking changed dramatically. So once in a while, I'll see, okay, what recipes are people searching for? I suddenly saw this, once the lockdown, especially in the US, started. You saw this insane spike on like people looking for like things to cook at home. And for some reason, banana bread was like the number one recipe by like orders of magnitude. I was like, why are people cooking banana bread? Then the next day, like at home, we made banana bread. But so you see some of this stuff. So, people cook differently. Entertainment traffic changed. People, education changed. So people were clearly sort of looking, what from the point of view of like whether it was homework or like trying to learn something. That changed significantly. Obviously, the biggest spike during this time was like, you could tell that people were reacting to the world around them. There was obviously COVID, right? Like you saw this sudden spike in people just trying to understand not just sort of the emergency things, but like what is happening, right? Like what are the rates like? What's happening in the world? It was also a year, especially in the US, right? Like you had a fairly contentious election, and it turned out that was sort of the situation in a bunch of countries. And so you saw the effects of all of that sort of coming in together in the search. Like in the US, you kind of at some point you started to see, for example, one of the features I had was movie show times, and you just saw that traffic die, and then all of a sudden you go like, oh, it looks like people might be going to theaters again. And similarly, vacations and travel and all of that, you kind of see the zero to go back up. And so it was an interesting sort of, at an aggregate level, it was an interesting sort of social experiment, social science thing to look at.
How do you see this space around virtual assistants kind of evolving? Obviously everybody has kind of Alexas at home.
Yep.
We use it, but what do you think we would need to overcome for it to be just everywhere, every day, every time?
The example I give, so my son was about 3 when the first version of Google Home came out. And so we had like a version at home a few months before, because I was working with the team on getting this up. And his favorite thing to do is to sort of go to it and say, please play like this song, right? And he learned that when he was when he could barely talk, right. And so I think about native interfaces for people, right? So at this point, I think all of us, if you've got young kids, are used to this idea, like if they see a screen, they sort of go and try and tap it, and like, oh yeah, like they expect it to react to them. In my view, at this point, like my son thinks of YouTube as a thing that he watches, but also that lives in these things, he sort of said like, play this on YouTube, or like, hey, can you ask Google that thing? Or like, I'm sure there are lots of people like, ask Alexa that thing. And so I think, people fall to native interfaces, right? So for me, the interface I'm most comfortable with is still a keyboard, right? So if I want to do significant amount of work, I'll open my laptop and start working on it. But there are lots of people, for them, the native interface is the phone, right? So even if they have a keyboard in front of them, they'll start doing this. I think there will be a generation for whom the native interface is voice. And they will want to interact with it. They will sort of want to get it. It will be the most comfortable way for them to sort of perform computational tasks. I think there are a few different things that need to sort of happen, right? The first is just the fidelity of how we interact with voice, right? So we have this notion of how often we can't catch, we don't get an error from it, right? And so it went from 90 to 95, which can feel like, okay, error rate, sort of the positive rate was 90%, and now we're at 95%. What's a big deal? But this is a huge deal in like, getting 1 in 10 words wrong and 1 in 20 words wrong. If your assistant is getting 10% of what you say wrong, that's like you're not going to use that. So as that thing goes up, right, I think it'll just be a lot more ubiquitous. It'll be easier to use. People will sort of just be better at like using it. So one is just fidelity. The second is it needs to be pleasurable to use, right? Which is right now we haven't built the interfaces so that you enjoy working with a digital assistant, right? So one of the things, when we think about voice, it's not just converting text to speech. It's converting it in a way that like is enjoyable to work with. When do you shorten the answer? When do you lengthen the answer? How long do you wait? Do you add variation in tone in a way that like is actually fun to use? And I think all of that stuff takes much longer than you think, and then it suddenly hits you, right? So I think I've been old enough to sort of watch like sort of the transition to mobile, and ever since I was in college, right, people were like, oh, mobile is coming, and you felt like almost for a 10-year period, mobile was coming until one fine day it was, oh yeah, we all just use mobile phones now. And so I think voice will be like that, which is you kind of see, and I think you're seeing this now, right, which is more hardware devices being sold, more things being voice enabled. So it is being more ubiquitous. It's interacting with more things in the world. So you see more actions. But it's still a little clunky. It's not quite there. It's not 100% comfortable for everyone. But at some point, this combination of things, hardware will get cheaper, voice will get better, UIs will get more sort of smooth. And you have all these things hit. And at some point, you'll be like, oh yeah, we all use voice now. At least that's a hypothesis, right? So that's what a lot of people believe. I tend to think that's likely to happen. Yeah. And so I think that's sort of what we're excited about.
Well, Satyajeet, thank you for those fascinating insights from your side. I'm sure our audience is going to enjoy the and glean a lot out of what you had to share and say. So thank you for being on the show. Appreciate you taking the time, and great having you. And hopefully we can bring you back again for some more questions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed the chat.